This is how I transformed my original yellowed out, crusty chrome headlights into these black housing, refreshed, almost like new headlights for around $12. So today we are finally getting started on rehabbing these old headlights. They are in really rough shape, so I'm really excited about this transformation. I think it's going to make a huge difference on the front end. I've never done this before, and I know typically you can throw them in the oven for like 210 or 220 degrees for a little while, but I'm going to try and heat them up with a heat gun, and hopefully I can get them separated. First, I started by removing the headlights. I'm working on a GX 470, but the process is similar for most vehicles. I removed 2 bolts holding the bumper near the wheel wells. There were a handful of bolts on the lower side, and I disconnected the fog lights before pulling the bumper away. In my case, I had to remove the bumper support brackets just below the headlights before they were finally free. After removing the headlights, it was time to disassemble them. These headlights are held together by a few screws and a row of what is most likely butyl tape. It is a black sticky sealant that gets much softer when heated. Typically, people will place their headlights in the oven, but I'm trying the heat gun method since I don't want to cook plastic in my oven. I ran the heat gun along the seam to evenly heat it. Then I used a few tools to carefully pry the headlight apart. Keep in mind that the tools you use will likely have a bunch of butyl stuff on them at the end of this process. After a lot of persuasion, I was finally able to separate the 2 pieces. My headlights had an inner or middle piece to them as well, so I had to separate it from the lens. This is the inside of the lens where the bulb had melted a weird spot. I got some haze on there. That is the outside of the nasty looking lens. It's the inside. So there was a bit of a hazy spot where that light had exploded and melted and broke a piece of the inside lamp area. But I polished it out using this rubbing compound, and I'll hit it with this other fine polish to get the rest of the residue off. I repeated the same process for the other side, only this time with much more confidence. I'm using a red Scotch-Brite to rough up all the chrome. I might get away with the gray Scotch-Brite, which is a little less aggressive. I basically just want to scuff it up really nice so the paint has something to bite into and stick. Alright, so here's the gray Scotch-Brite. Yeah, I think that'll do the trick. Just roughing it up so the paint can stick to it. Be sure to mask off any part that you don't want painted. In my case, I wanted this spot below the orange reflector to remain chrome. Next, I wiped everything down with rubbing alcohol to remove any contaminants that will prevent the paint from sticking and going on evenly. I applied a few light coats, letting the paint flash off or mostly dry in between. When painting, I like to spray the hardest to get to places first, then I'll put a nice even coat on what's left of the easy to get to parts. Then it was time for reassembly. Before sticking the two pieces back together, I heated the butyl and ran a screwdriver into the groove to ensure there were not any obstructions that would get in the way. I pressed the lens assembly back into the housing, making sure it was seated all the way. During this process, I reheated the seam and squeezed the pieces back together. Once they were back together, I ran a thin bead of black silicone along the seam, just as a precaution to keep out any moisture. Now that the headlights were back together in a complete watertight assembly, it was time to address the outer lens. My lenses were so pitted and faded that I began by dry sanding with 320 grit sandpaper. Then I wet sanded with 600 grit. I gave them a good wash and dry before spraying automotive clear coat over the lens. The clear coat will fill in the 600 grit scratches, and you won't be able to tell it was sanded down underneath. The automotive clear will add a nice protective layer that should last many years. I carefully reinstalled both headlights, then the bumper. Since the headlights were looking so fresh, I had to address the poorly painted grille. I gave it a good sanding and a fresh coat of trim paint. Now, although they are not perfect, the headlights look way better than what we started with. If you enjoyed this video, or if it gave you some motivation for getting your headlights done, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I went through all this work because there are hardly any aftermarket options available for the GX470, and the ones that are around $500 for the pair. I was able to refinish these for around $12 to $30, considering that I already had a lot of the materials on hand.